Eleanor was there. She had received word that her husband was seriously ill. So she was the one who grabbed his bags. They got back home. She unpacked the bags. And this is where an odd trait of the Roosevelt family turned out to work in Franklin Roosevelt's severe disfavor. The Roosevelts were keepers. They never threw anything away. If Franklin Roosevelt had had any sense, or maybe, see here again, I don't know, maybe these letters were not particularly, shall I say, incriminating. Or maybe he didn't think they were. He didn't throw them away. He didn't leave them in France. There they were in his bag. Eleanor read the letters. And Eleanor realized the nature of his relationship with Lucy. Again, I can't tell you exactly what the relationship was, but it was serious enough that Eleanor, well, she threatened to leave Franklin, except that's not exactly the way she put it. Eleanor had a strong strain of the martyr complex in her. And so the way she put it, she offered Franklin his freedom. She would grant him a divorce. In those days, getting a divorce was not at all easy, especially if anybody contested the divorce. So if Eleanor had fought the divorce, there wouldn't have been a divorce. But she said, as she put it, she offered Franklin his freedom. And here's where the plot thickens. And you have to figure out whom to believe. And I don't know exactly whom to believe. But one version says that Franklin immediately says, no, I will stay with you, if only for the sake of the children. Well, he certainly did have the children's interests in mind. But another version of the story says he thought it over. He thought, well, maybe I will. And he only decided not to leave Eleanor or to accept Eleanor's offer when his mother, Sarah, threatened to cut off the money. Franklin Roosevelt's father had been very wealthy. When he died, he bequeathed most of the estate to Sarah, his wife, his widow. And Sarah doled out the money in very modest fashion to Franklin. She was generous, but she was not willing to give Franklin any financial independence. She liked the idea that Franklin had to come to her for anything that he wanted. Now, another person might well have said, okay, in response to this, I'll go make a living of my own. I don't have to be dependent on my mother. But Franklin Roosevelt didn't make that decision. The result was that he remained dependent on his mother, even, believe it or not, after he became President of the United States. He was still on an allowance. And in those days, presidents didn't make enough money. Becoming President of the United States was a losing proposition. People left the White House poorer than they went in. Now, as a matter of fact, actually, that happens to presidents today, too. But they expect to make it up by selling their memoirs for $10 million or whatever they're going to do. Or giving speeches for $200,000 a pop. You know, it's kind of the standard practice. In those days, there wasn't a market for that sort of thing. So, anyway, so Franklin Roosevelt decides to stay with Eleanor. Part of the deal, though, well, there are two stipulations. One is, you must promise never to see Lucy again. That's a perfectly reasonable demand. And Franklin Roosevelt said, right, okay, I'll do it. Now, as a matter of fact, he didn't quite follow through on that. Oh gosh, no, we're not going to get there, sorry. He'll have to read the book. The other stipulation was that, well, and this is basically no more sex. Okay, well, now, you gotta, any of you, have to figure out what to make of this. You know, okay, so you tell Franklin Roosevelt at the time was 36 years old. So you tell this 36-year-old guy, in good health, there's not going to be any more sex. You know, at least not at home. So I don't know what Eleanor expected to happen after this. I don't know, how she expected Franklin to react. Was he supposed to take this as an enforced vow of celibacy? Was he supposed to take this as implicit permission to have affairs but just keep the damn things discreet? I don't know. This is complicated fairly shortly by the second great crisis of Franklin Roosevelt's personal life, and that was his contraction of polio in the summer of 1921. For Franklin Roosevelt to come down with polio at the age of 39, first of all, was so unusual for anybody to come down with polio at the age of 39. Polio was a childhood disease. Adults almost never came down with polio, and because it was so rare, the doctors missed the diagnosis for the first 2 weeks. They thought it must be something else. In fact, it's so rare that medical historians since, some of them anyway, have concluded that the diagnosis, the eventual diagnosis of polio, was wrong. That adults didn't get polio. And so they have proposed various other explanations for this. The general feeling is that yes, indeed, it was polio. And maybe the reason he contracted it was precisely his sheltered childhood. The polio virus was, and frankly still is, very common around the world. And it was certainly common in the United States. But nearly everybody encountered it as a child. And they encountered it as a child when their immune system could deal with it. And most people who encountered the polio virus showed no symptoms whatsoever. Some people came down with the equivalent of a mild case of flu, shook it off, and that was that. Never knew that they had polio. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt is the only example of what you could call a celebrity case of polio in American history. There's no other high-profile person who contracted polio as an adult. Anyway, now what this meant to Roosevelt is hard to say, but I've got to figure it out, however hard it might be to say. I need to point out that Franklin Roosevelt was not only healthy and good-looking, he was exceedingly athletic. And he prided himself on his physical strength, his ability to, on the decks of bounding destroyers, he would run up and down, and he would, whenever he was in politics, he would jump out of the cars and press the flash. He was everywhere. He played golf all the time. He was a horseback rider. He did everything an active young guy would do, and all of a sudden he can't do any of that at all. He would never walk again. He could never stand unaided. He eventually was able to stand with these very heavy braces that locked his knees in place. He developed the semblance of a walk, but of course he had no feeling below his hips, and the only thing that he could do is with crutches or with the help of a person on either side, he could kind of swing his hips in a way so that his dead legs would allow him to make progress. He lived at a time when the media, meaning for the most part newspapers, and radio, and it's significant that radio is sound, radio isn't pictures. The media essentially conspired to conceal the extent of Roosevelt's disability from the American people. It wasn't a secret. In fact, you can go back, I've gone back. You can read the major newspapers. In 1921, 1922, 1923, 1924. 1924 is when he makes his political comeback. He spends 21 through 24 rehabilitating in Warm Springs, Georgia, for the most part. He makes a comeback at the Democratic National Convention in 24. And there are quite detailed descriptions of how Roosevelt, this polio sufferer, with great effort made his way to the lectern. And nobody's hiding the fact that he has had polio. Nobody's hiding the fact that he cannot walk unaided.